Good morning and good evening. I'm James Green, a senior research fellow at Georgetown University's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Today, our discussion is with Susan Thornton, and the subject is prospects for U.S.-China diplomatic dialogue under the Biden administration. President Biden took the oath of office just over a month ago, and his first visit to a major cabinet office was to the Department of State on February 4. And at that meeting, President Biden said, American leadership must meet this new moment of advanced authoritarianism, including the growing ambitions of China to rival the United States and the determination of Russia to damage and disrupt our democracy. We'll also directly take on the challenges posed by our prosperity, security, and democratic values by our most serious competitor, China. Through a series of telephonic outreaches, first by Secretary of State Blinken to Yang Jiechi, then a 2-hour conversation between President Biden and President Xi on February 10, both sides released some information about that call, which covered a wide range of topics, from human rights to climate change, the pandemic to global security. Here to assess where we are on the prospects for diplomacy between the United States and China is someone who spent almost 3 decades in the Department of State, serving both in Washington and overseas. Susan Thornton is a visiting lecturer in law at the Yale Law School, where she's also a senior fellow at the Paul Tsai Center, China Center. In 2018, she retired from the State Department, having served in East and Central Asia, and prior to serving in Washington, D.C. as the acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, she spent 18 years in posts around Central Asia, Russia, the Caucasus, and China. She has a degree from the National Defense University, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Bowdoin College. Susan and I did a podcast for this series, and one of the things that I remember most was, what is a démarche? And Susan went through all the mechanics of what one country does to represent another. So this event is co-sponsored by the Georgetown Asian Studies Program and the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. Participants can send questions to uschinadialogue@georgetown.edu. Again, that's uschinadialogue@georgetown.edu. So now that I've set the stage, 2 countries have had initial outreach. Let's start with the discussion, Susan. First, welcome. Second, let me say, you're someone who's been inside the State Department and overseas. I wanted to get to what it's like during a transition, and I'll just say my own personal experience, having served at the U.S. Embassy as the trade minister counselor at a time when our trade policy was, we shall say, changing. This was at the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration. And of course, as you're representing your country, you're presenting yourself to the foreign government. And this is a change in policy, a continuation, but this is what the executive has decided. Can you just talk, before we get to the substance of where we are on US-China, what it's like to be either in the State Department or overseas when there's a change of administration? Because, as I said, the Biden team has been in place for just over a month, and people inside the State Department and other parts of the bureaucracy have had to deal with that. So welcome, Susan. Great to see you, and look forward to our discussion today.
Great to be with you, James. Good to see you, and thank you to the audience for tuning in with us this morning, this evening, wherever you are for this discussion. It's a really important discussion, I think. And as James points out, we're in a bit of a transition phase right now. I think the obvious point to make here is that the world doesn't stop just because the US is changing its government. So people in positions in the State Department, elsewhere in the US government, they keep working. It is difficult, though, because you're waiting for people to get confirmed into positions, and you're waiting for guidance about what the new priorities might be, what exactly the policies are that are changing. I think it's less true this time that you can just keep going based on the old policy priorities, because, of course, under the Trump administration, we really broke the mold on US foreign policy consensus overseas. The US pulled out of the world, basically. People working in the State Department were labeled deep state, and they were pretty tentative about what they did in the last administration. So I think now others are not really waiting for what for us to figure out what we're going to do. And, we have to try to move forward while everybody's expecting big changes, but we don't really know what they are yet. And I think it is going to be very difficult for people working, especially in overseas embassies, people are waiting for foreign policy pronouncements from the Biden administration. They're not really coming, although we do have this expectation of change. And so people are kind of treading water out there, I imagine.
Yeah, I wonder if you could clear up for those people who aren't used to the mechanics of, say, ambassadorial appointments. I know there's been a lot of speculation in Beijing and in other capitals about who the U.S. ambassador will be there. As someone who's served both overseas and in Washington, can you just describe or clear up, which posts are political, which ones are career people? How does that work out, and what happens in a transition between one administration and another one?
Well, this is an interesting discussion because there's a debate right now. And if you listen to people talking about reforms of the State Department, the foreign policy process, there's a lot of discussion about this waiting between career and political appointees. But I think right now, most of the overseas ambassadorial positions are vacant. All of the political appointees would have had to vacate on January 20th. There are career people that are continuing in overseas ambassadorships that were continued over from the last administration. That's still probably about more than 50% of the positions, but a lot of those were unfilled because of confirmation headaches in the last administration and the sort of revolving door nature of the personnel appointments. There are a lot of also in various agencies around the Washington, and the State Department's no exception, political appointee jobs in the agency itself. State has potentially fewer of these than other agencies because a lot of the so-called political slots are actually filled by career foreign service officers in a typical administration. And we will also see that in this administration, I believe. It was not that true of the last administration. But of course, you have people at the top, the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State. Those two nominees have been named and Tony Blinken's been confirmed. We have the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, which is usually a career foreign service officer, and that job is going, as we have heard, to Victoria Nuland, who was a career foreign service officer, retired, and has been brought back to be the nominee for that job. And then in other bureaus and departments within the State Department, you'll have political appointees in a lot of those positions as well. And some people filtering, a lot of them so far this administration, into the policy planning office. I know where, James, you worked previously.
Yeah, and it's a place where when I was there in the transition between Bush and Obama, you can put a fair number of political appointees in there because they don't require Senate confirmation. They just need a simple background check. And so it can be staffed early up. Having been in that transition, that was an exciting place to be for the first 6 months of an administration while the rest of the bureaucracy works itself out. I'm curious, we'll get to the specifics of people in the administration and their views on China, but I'm curious your comment that actually the political levers, the political positions don't go very deep in the State Department. As someone who's worked in different agencies, my impression is actually, having a DAS level person, a deputy assistant secretary level person at the political level is actually pretty far down into the bureaucracy. For a lot of other agencies, particularly on the military and the intelligence community, the political appointees don't go that deep. And so it kind of depends on which side of the fence you're on, I guess.
True.
I wanted to ask, switching on to the specifics of China policy, how do you see personnel positions of the Biden team, their views for dealing with China and the Asia Pacific? And I guess, as you mentioned, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, he had his hearing in which he was asked specifically, about one of the things that the outgoing Trump administration did, which was declare what was happening in Xinjiang to be genocide in Western China against the Uyghurs. And Secretary of Treasury designate Janet Yellen mentioned China was cheating on currency and other areas of trade. This is somewhat forceful language for an incoming team on Chinese behavior. How would you assess where we are, both in terms of the nominees who've been confirmed by the Senate, but also other people who are rumored, as you said, like Victoria Nuland, to be Undersecretary of State?
Yeah, just to point out that the declaration of genocide in Xinjiang was made by the outgoing administration, this outgoing Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, on January 19th, to give you some sense of the politics around that declaration. But yeah, I would say the appointments and the comments so far from administration appointees all speak to the need to prioritize the urgent crises that they're facing. And most of those crises have to do with domestic policy. Seasoned hands on foreign policy can come in and quietly rebuild and restore relationships. And so we see that they have these seasoned hands coming back into the administration. I think that speaks to the desire to get going and rebuild and restore quietly without a lot of on-the-job training, so to speak. These people know what to do, they know what to say, and importantly, they know what not to say. So I think Biden needs a foreign policy pause, basically. He's picked a team that he thinks can get him that. And at the same time, these are people that are experienced and they can win back points with partners and allies and get going on some projects. I mean, you've already seen us, renew the New START treaty with Russia, for example. They don't want to have to waste a lot of time. I think the specific harsh comments about China that you mentioned are kind of what the traffic will bear right now in the US environment on China. I don't like the habit of insulting other countries and other leaders, but that's kind of where we are. As a diplomat, I find it to be counterproductive, but it seems to be where the politics and the discussion and discourse in this country have taken us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember having started first work on China in the US government in the 1990s. At that time, the assistant secretary position, the position you held during the Trump administration, was a critical position for making decisions on China. And now, clearly, the decision on what happens with China is beyond even the Secretary of State, let's be honest, right? I mean, these are kind of presidential level decisions, not every day-to-day things, but on the broad strategic focus on where we should go. The assistant secretary is, a note taker if they're lucky going to a meeting. They're not the ones that are driving the policy. No offense to whoever gets that job or to you in having that, but the politics and the policies have changed. And so that, working with China is and dealing with China and the China challenge is just so central. I wanted to get to some of the nuts and bolts of the diplomacy. So the Secretary of State, as I mentioned, spoke to Yang Jiechi, his Chinese counterpart. President spoke. Rob Malley, who's the Iran coordinator for the White House, spoke with Vice Minister Ma Jiaoshu. What sort of diplomatic engagements would you expect in the next, say, 6 months and 12 months? And what would the goals be from the US point of view and from the Chinese point of view of those sorts of engagements? How do you see this unfolding in the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I expect the restoration of the kind of low-key normal engagements between the US and China that really should have been happening all along. We have to get channels open to start working practically on solving urgent issues, both issues between the US and China, but also these larger multilateral issues that are coming up. And the most proximate one that I see is the Iran JCPOA effort to get some kind of agreement done with Iran. And the Chinese were involved in that initially, as you mentioned. Rob Malley talked to Ma Jiaoshu about it. US authority and credibility and reputation have been undermined, I think, by the previous administration. And Biden wants to restore some of that before asking Beijing for things. This is I want to approach China from a position of strength. But the big question for me is the second part of your question, which is how much has the Trump administration really shifted the thinking in China about relations with the US and what China can get done with the US and how it should approach the US. How much do they really value relations with the United States versus having sort of given up on us and made a determination to sort of work around us and let us kind of do what we're going to do and not sort of focus so much on the US-China relationship. I mean, as you're well aware, it used to be the most important relationship in the eyes of the Chinese foreign policy establishment. And, it was both for reasons of trying to get things done, but also reasons of sort of defense, I think, and prevention in terms of not letting the relationship become, dwindle down to the point that it did under the last administration. But now I really don't know how they are going to approach things. They've talked a lot about multilateralism, and it could be that they're just going to preference working with others as opposed to working with us.
Yeah, so on that, I wonder if you could comment. One of the first things that the Biden team did was to rejoin the World Health Organization, to lift the blocking of a new director general for the World Trade Organization. How do you think those sorts of commitments to multilateral institutions affects the Chinese view of the United States and of these institutions? How was that? Was that a wise diplomatic move? And if so, what do you think the U.S. can benefit from doing those sorts of things early on in the Biden administration?
Yeah, well, I really think that the Biden team has to focus on strengthening the international system. And, the Chinese have been talking about multilateralism. They've been kind of filling the vacuum during the Trump administration in these multilateral organizations on the global stage. And so for the US to come in and say, no, we're going to recommit to the international system, I think that is an absolutely necessary but insufficient first step. What we really need to do is work with our allies and partners to strengthen that international system, to, build new rules, abide by the rules we have, try to find a way to enforce the rules, and, at the same time, work with other countries to do that. And I think, the Biden administration has signaled that that's what they want to do. I hope that they can stay focused on that. That's what's important to other countries, actually, too.
On that, I wanted to ask on the friends and allies front, right towards the very end of the Trump administration, during the transition, December, before the Biden team came in, the European Union signed or made an agreement in principle with China for a comprehensive agreement on investment. This is a bilateral investment agreement, something smaller than a free trade agreement, but quite significant. And in some ways, the EU ignored the request of the incoming National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who doesn't take to Twitter much, but did on this specific point, asking the Europeans, in essence, to kind of postpone this agreement. And essentially that was ignored. And the Europeans said, look, we want to do this for what's in our interest. And we're moving ahead with this comprehensive agreement on investment. Apparently the Europeans actually pronounce it Kai, which I said was, I was joking, actually means open in Chinese, as you well know. Anyway, so the two sides have moved ahead with that. The President Biden spoke to the Munich Security Conference on Friday. I'm losing my days of the week. I think it was Friday. Trying to repair transatlantic relations there. But what do you see as the prospects for the U.S. working with Europe when, say, right out of the gate on a modest trade issue, the Europeans told the United States to basically go pound sand, thanks for your use, but we're going to move ahead with China?
Well, I mean, I have spent a lot of time in the last year talking to U.S. partners and allies around the world, and in particular the Europeans, about what might be an agenda where we could work together that would also have the benefit of helping to move the relationship with China in a better direction. And what I found is that it's not going to be so easy. The US and Europe have similar priorities, we have similar challenges, and we have similar ways of approaching problems, but we actually don't agree on a lot of the major areas that are sticking points now with China. For example, technology, for example, trade issues. These are all quite thorny issues in the US-European relationship, actually. And so it's been a long time that we've been wrestling with Europe over these issues, and to try to think now that we're going to all of a sudden come together because of China and solve them quickly, I think is, not really on the cards. What I think the US has failed to understand is that really the current changing power dynamics make the international system and multilateralism and rules ever more important for us. we've kind of lost sight of that. This is not the moment to junk the international and multilateral system. And, it's not going to be that easy to get everybody back on board on the same page. But that is certainly, I think, what we need to try to do.
On that, I mean, I think one of the things that this administration has done, the Biden team, right out of the gate, is to set up a bit of an ideological struggle between authoritarian capitalism on one side, with China being the standard bearer and Russia being the DD, the little brother, and liberal democracy on the other side, which I think in their mind they see the U.S. as the leader there. At the town hall last week in Wisconsin, I have to say, watching President Biden talking to Anderson Cooper and spending a couple of minutes on China, somewhat shocking as someone who's wasted most of my career working on China, and to see so much airtime given to this, including talking about Xinjiang and Uyghurs. And I never thought that major television broadcasts would include information about the Uyghurs. But at that town hall, President Biden judged that China is trying very hard to be the world leader. How does that assessment and the kind of broader framing that this team is doing on the U.S.-China struggle for kind of dominance for the global narrative of ideology, how does that complicate or enhance U.S. diplomacy with Beijing or with our friends and allies and other nations around the world?
Yeah, your comment that you never thought that we would see the details of sort of what China's doing internally be so prominent on a major, presidential television broadcast really resonates with me. And I think that we need to think about why that's happening. I mean, I think that Biden is right that China wants to be a world leader. We can debate about whether it wants to be the world leader, and there's a big difference. But, US policy formerly was to encourage China to take on a greater role of responsibility in world leadership. We wanted them to contribute more so that we didn't have to bear all of these disparate burdens. And China resisted at that time. You'll remember well, this was the Robert Zoellick's effort to get China to be a responsible stakeholder in the early 2000s. China was very inwardly focused and didn't want to be saddled with these burdens to contribute multilaterally. Now, China's ready to pursue this kind of bigger role, and the context has changed, obviously, and we feel threatened. My view is that this has a lot more to do with the US than it does with China. I think Biden really needs to bring back US confidence and credibility. This, as I mentioned earlier, this so-called position of strength that he keeps talking about. Probably a lot of people don't know what he's talking about, but we need confidence. Because if we're acting from a point of insecurity, we're not going to do the right things for our long-term prosperity and stability and benefit. So I think this will entail sort of working slowly to find a way back to working with China. I don't like calling this cooperation or competition. To me, those are tactics or means. They're not really a goal or a strategy. We need to figure out where each of us stands on the issues of priority importance, and then figure out how to move forward on them. And, you can call the strategy solving problems that people care about. I don't really understand why we need to talk all the time about extreme competition. Just get together and solve problems and, worry about what we call it later.
Thank you for the mention of Robert Zoellick. And I should say, for those who are interested, I have a podcast episode of the U.S.-China Dialogue podcast with Ambassador Zoellick, who talks through those issues and some of the framing around the responsible stakeholder speech and where he is now. And then he went on to be, as head of the World Bank. I wanted to ask you just before getting to the questions from the audience about the change in Chinese policy. We've been talking a lot about the United States because we have a new administration in Washington and there's a lot of changes on our end. But I wanted to get your assessment on where you see changes in Chinese policy. One of the reasons I ask is in a podcast interview with one of the other USTRs that I interviewed, Charlene Barshevsky, I asked her, when do you think Chinese policy shifted towards not being so interested in opening up the domestic economy? And we were focused on the WTO part of that equation, specifically given her role in getting China into the WTO in 2001. But she had the earliest date that I ever heard anyone say in terms of the shifting Chinese view of where reform and opening should go or backing away from it. And her year was 2006, which was, in her mind, that was 5 years after WTO accession. And the Chinese leadership felt like, yep, we already gave enough on opening up our economy to foreigners. We're not so interested in doing that anymore. We're going to consolidate what we've already agreed to, but we're not going to make any new commitments. I think other people might look at 2008 or 2010 as the time when Chinese policy really started to shift, and there was less of an interest in being quiet and behind the scenes, and more an interest in saying, hey, we're a world power. We have these expectations of what the rest of the globe is going to do for us. But before I get to the questions, I just wanted to ask, how do you see that? It's a long question, but as saying, where do you see a shift in Chinese policy? Or maybe you don't, but sometime in the 2010s in which Chinese policy became more assertive and the Chinese government was more interested in making its issues on the top of their global agenda?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't really see the kind of dramatic shift that people are always looking for. I remember being in Beijing before Xi Jinping came to power, obviously, when Hu Jintao was president and general secretary of the Communist Party. And I remember at that time that a lot of the policies of the Hu Wen administration were seen by people in China as a reaction to the fast opening and liberalization of the previous, Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji administration, for lack of a better word. And so I think it's been an evolution. Hu Wen did pursue a lot of policies to try to counteract the negative effects of the WTO administration accession on the Chinese population. So you already saw some of this less attention being paid to economic liberalization, private sector support, that kind of thing, and more being focused on help for the countryside, for example. I think 2008 was a major wake-up call for the Chinese government, though, and I can see why Charlene might have said that 2006 you saw them turning away from liberalization, but really the shock of the great financial crisis and the psychological impact that would have had on the Chinese leadership at that time, as far as, the implications of fast opening, it would have really strengthened the hand of people who were arguing that, China doesn't need to go down the road of major opening and major liberalization. And I think there were a lot of things that happened around that time. Chinese have their own, of course, internal issues that they were grappling with, and corruption problems, et cetera, which would have contributed to all of this. But I see 2008 as a major break point following, the Beijing Olympics, and then the great financial crisis going into 2009, China coming in with a major injection of stimulus to help the world recover from the great financial crisis. I think a lot of that would have changed the psychology of the leadership in Beijing quite dramatically.
Super. Well, I, of course, could spend the rest of the morning chatting with you. Let's get to some of the questions that we have. Thank you, Toya, for putting them on the chat box. The first one is a very good kind of prioritization and siloing question, which is, the person asks, is it realistic for the US to take different approaches with China based on the issue? That is, having a constructive dialogue on trade that follows the phase one trade deal, but punitive one on human rights. How will China react? And I take that to mean, is it realistic for the US to, on the one hand, talk to China about an area that there's some common ground, say climate change, but on the other hand, continue to label what's happening in Xinjiang as genocide? Can we operate that way? Is it realistic to have that sort of interaction, transactional interaction with Beijing's diplomats?
So this is the most important question that the new administration has to grapple with and face, and that everyone who works on never mind if it's US-China relations or foreign policy issues in general, has to think about. I think it's absolutely imperative that we separate out these issues into different tracks and talk about them in practical terms. That's what governments do. That's what diplomats do. That's what we should be doing. But the other issue is you've got to have some kind of a relationship with, in general, the people in government of that other country in order to make that work. So the US has great difficulty publicly treating China as a legitimate power, because of its Communist Party leadership. And this was taken to new lengths under the Trump administration. Things have gotten much, much worse. So you've got to have a respectful working relationship, and then you can have these different tracks of progress. And you can certainly call out human rights and at the same time have a productive trade negotiation going. Chinese are very practical about this kind of thing in their working relationships. It's absolutely not only possible, but absolutely necessary. But it does require, a modicum of respectful discourse, and that's what we're missing right now.
Ticking it up one level, one of the questions is, what should we want from US-China relations, and do we have the resources and tools to achieve these outcomes? And I guess maybe I would just depend by saying, you worked at the consulate in Chengdu, am I remembering correctly?
Yes.
Which is now closed. One of the basic kind of building blocks of a diplomatic engagement is having consulates. It's not the only one, but it is one. For both a broad level and a practical level, are we correctly, what should the goals be, and are we correctly resourced to meet those goals?
Yeah, I think the goal is the same goal that we've had from the beginning, which is to bind China into the international system. And in order to do that, of course, we've got to have good rules, we've got to have enforcement, and we've got to provide an example that the US and other countries are going to abide by these rules. As China gets more and more powerful, it's going to be more and more difficult to do this. And certainly, there are going to be a lot of episodes where we're going to have trouble with this. But at the end of the day, what we have to hope for is that China evolves such that it sees the wisdom of binding itself into the international system, which I think it should see. Having rules and having predictability is going to end up being good for major powers, as it is for middle powers eventually in a multipolar world that we're going to be living in. And I think, the issue is going to be sort of how do issues come up in the future that are, by their very nature, transnational, and so force the international community to work together on things like pandemics, for example. But also, I think climate change is just going to be so compelling and such an urgent prospect very, very soon that maybe that will be the issue that can sort of galvanize this international system to put aside a lot of the other issues that are maybe more peripheral. They may not seem peripheral today, but in the face of a real crisis, they'll quickly become peripheral. And I think that's what we have to sort of look toward and hope for. And, I think it's very important that the US actually discipline itself in the international system. And, that will help in trying to get China to bind itself in. I think that's what we should be going for still.
And on the resources question, in terms of, say, US government personnel who are Chinese speakers, or on other aspects of the intelligence community or our financial regulators, do we have the resources and tools in place, in your view, to kind of meet those goals that you had set out?
Well, here I have to agree with President Biden. The very first thing we have to do is really fix our own domestic governing institutions and make our model work better for people in America and for those that we deal with around the world. I think, there's a lot that needs to be done in this country, and we've shown a kind of shocking inability to really reform ourselves and change. We've got an extremely broken political system that's not doing what it needs to do to discipline our economy, et cetera. That's the most urgent need that I see. And whether we have the people in Congress and in other institutions to help us do that, I'll let you all be the judge. But on foreign policy issues specifically, I mean, we need more people that can work in multilateral fora and that understand that this is a frustrating, incremental process, but that can stick with it and that can get things done on a practical level. I mean, that, we're not going to, invent a new wheel. This is what we have. It's multilateral diplomacy. It's really hard, it's frustrating, and it's slow. But you have to listen to what other countries are telling you about what they're interested in and find those areas of compromise. And if you're not doing that, you're not getting anywhere.
On the governance issue, as we were all reflecting on what happened in Texas and the huge amount of snow and loss of power and then loss of water for millions of Texans, and their Senator Ted Cruz took off to Mexico, and those of us could enjoy that bit of the deliciousness of having a major senator kind of make a political gaffe in the public eye. I was reflecting on how different it would be in the Chinese system. That is, there are plenty of Chinese officials who hop a plane down to Macau when something bad happens in their district, and no one ever hears about it. I'm particularly reminded of when I was living in Shanghai. There was a New Year's party on the Bund, and a number of people got crushed in a mob that was just kind of mishandled. And it was not on purpose. It was not an angry mob. It was just people going to watch the fireworks, I guess. And then someone leaked the bill of the district mayor. Shanghai has these district mayors. The district mayor at that very moment was eating at an extremely high-end Japanese restaurant for like hundreds or thousands of dollars. And magically that bill got released. And so that vice mayor found a new job. Or
fired.
Yeah, exactly. But all of which to say is, I don't disagree at all with our governance challenges. And I do think that's something we need to work on domestically. We've seen it through social protests over the summer. But I do feel like our system has the tools to be self-corrective in a way that the Chinese system, which is so closed, kind of doesn't, as increasingly closed. On the kind of closed nature, one of the questions from the viewers is on human rights, which you had touched on. Just a very basic question: how can the Chinese government, be incentivized to do better? And what could we hope to accomplish regarding human rights in China?
That's a really important question. And I think the example that you just mentioned gets to it, which is the Chinese government does respond to public pressure. They have a different way of doing it than elections, obviously, and we may not think it's as representative or democratic or effective, but they do care a lot about public opinion in China and public perceptions. And very importantly, they also care a lot about their reputation in the world and about how others see them, see China, see the Chinese government. This legitimacy problem that I mentioned earlier comes into play here as well. We want China to aspire to be a good global citizen, and we want them to take reputational damage seriously. And so, you have to figure out how to use that. I think in the international system, I think our human rights efforts with China have to be multilateral. They can't be unilateral, and especially they can't be unilateral if other countries don't follow us. So we're the only ones raising things, because then it seems like it's just a sort of anti-China attack, and they'll dismiss it. So it has to be done with international backing, a sort of a coalition of countries putting pressure on, reputational pressure. I don't think these sanctions do any good, and they're probably going to end up doing long-term damage. But you can accomplish the same thing by issuing a statement of censure in either the Human Rights Council or separate from the Human Rights Council if you can't get it done there. So that's my, it's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to be satisfied. It's going to be very incremental, but I actually think that the Chinese government will be making changes in a lot of the areas that we are pointing to as problematic now. They're just not going to do it in a way that can be seen as responding to international pressure. And I'll just mention here one other thing, which is going back to this issue of the genocide declaration that was made and then was reaffirmed by Tony Blinken. Now you're seeing multiple calls for the United States to boycott the upcoming Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. I mean, who knows if those Olympics will be held given the pandemic and everything else, but I think it's important to keep in mind that a colleague in Europe said to me, if the US wanted to find, a magic bullet to stop all possible cooperation between the US and allies on China, raising a boycott of the Olympics is the way to do it. So, we have to think about before we go and act, how are other countries going to see these issues and what are they likely to do? Because now we're kind of stuck out there on a limb with this bill in the House about boycotting the Olympics, and nobody's going to follow us.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the point of working with allies on human rights. I was on an Arabic TV station maybe last week in which I said, the US focus on Xinjiang cannot simply be with the other Anglo-Saxon powers, with the Five Eyes. It can't just be with the white people of Europe. If we really want to try to work on these issues, we need to talk to Muslim countries, Turkic countries around the world. This needs to be something that's not just, as you said, a battering ram that the folks in Foggy Bottom at the State Department use to jam the Chinese. It has to be something that is really seen as a global effort. I wanted to switch to a very big picture, another big picture question that came in, which is, for the US, would it be helpful to distinguish between countries that are rivals as opposed to countries that are fully threats? If so, wouldn't China be among the former, that is a rival, and Russia be the latter? You've worked on Russia. I guess, how would you see those contrasting approaches for the US between dealing with China and dealing with Russia, putting the labels aside, if you'd like?
I don't like labeling countries as rivals and threats, so I will put the labels aside. And I also think it's very damaging for US foreign policy to do that, and for policy in general to do that, because it locks you into a track and also creates a certain narrative that you find it very hard to escape from, which is where we are now. And so it's going to force us into doing things that are probably not the wisest kinds of actions, like calling for a boycott of the US of the Winter Olympics. But on the China-Russia issue, I mean, I think that there are a lot of similarities between China and Russia in terms of their sort of internal view of how they see themselves in the world and what their ambitions are. But I think China still cares a lot about its reputation in the world, about being seen as a global, good actor. You may find that to be a bit hard to believe, but I think they do see themselves in that way. And I think Russia is a little bit different. There's just a lot more that comes from having a chip on the shoulder, this kind of sentiment of insecurity that comes from being a former empire and losing your empire, that kind of thing. So I think there's a difference in the psychology, there's a difference in the behavior, and I don't really see either China or Russia as a major threat to the United States, but clearly there are things that both are doing that are deleterious to US interests and to the interests of countries in the various regions where they're located. And so trying to deal with that on a practical level, while also keeping in mind that these are two really important countries and they can't just be dismissed. We need to figure out ways to work with them.
A very good question on Taiwan. Thank you for that. I think it's good to remember what our limits are and what our broad goals should be in dealing with these great powers. these are things that are not going away. And as difficult as it is to deal with Beijing or Moscow, we're going to have to deal with them. That's just the price of being a global leader that the United States is. On maybe one of the most challenging parts of the US-China relationship, Taiwan, how will the new administration deal with the Trump administration's increased allowances for official diplomacy with Taiwan? I'm not saying you have to agree with that question, but this is the question. And will these advances be reversed, untouched, or ignored?
Yeah, well, I think that the Biden administration will certainly continue an active level of support for Taiwan, while at the same time being sure to not break and not be seen to break the precedents that were long established by previous, however many administrations under the U.S. One China policy, which does allow for contacts and which does allow for support for Taiwan. Certainly, it allows for defense sales to Taiwan, but I don't see them trying. I mentioned earlier that what Joe Biden really needs to do is focus on urgent domestic crises, and he doesn't want a foreign policy crisis. And Taiwan is a huge foreign policy crisis if it comes, and it's also easily, I think, deflected or delayed or deferred. And I also happen to think that keeping Taiwan's current status and maintaining a stable status quo in the Taiwan Strait is in the best interests of the United States. It's in the best interests of the region. It's in the best interests of people on Taiwan, certainly, who enjoy a tremendous amount of autonomy, freedom, and prosperity. I think Taiwan's GDP per capita is, approaching the GDP per capita of the United States. So they've really been tremendously successful under the current status quo, but it's also in the best interest of China. And I think that is the obvious and reasonable path for the Biden administration to pursue.
Thanks for that. And before I get to the last question, I'll just put my editorial comment in. I've seen a lot of so-called international strategy experts and others focus in on Taiwan in the last couple of years. As the number of China experts has increased, the number of people who have started to pay attention to Taiwan has increased. But I don't feel like there's been a whole lot of new insights or assessments as to what our approach should be to Taiwan. I agree with what you had laid out. And I feel like in some ways, because there are a whole lot of new people who feel like they should have something to say on China, they therefore then look to Taiwan and they surface it as, oh, this is a potential area of conflict. And sure, of course it is. And all of us who've worked on China over the last 3, 4, 5 decades know that. The question is, what's your proposed policy solution? And so far, I haven't heard anything that's particularly compelling, as you say, that we should really be changing what our approach is.
Well, what's even worse is that sometimes people think that wouldn't it be fun to use Taiwan as a tool to sort of bludgeon China or at least poke it in the eye. And that's extremely dangerous for people on Taiwan to be used in that way. So I think we need to think about why we're doing things with respect to Taiwan and make sure that we're clear-eyed about what it is we're really trying to do and whether that's a really good idea or not.
Yeah, I was joking with a colleague that for a number of different China-related issues, Hong Kong and Xinjiang, we should have a bit of a Hippocratic oath. First, do no harm. The first goal should be not to hurt the people in those places that we're looking to help. Yeah. And Taiwan obviously is not under PRC control, and so it's quite different. But I take your point. I think that's right. That is, we have to think about what's in the interest of those people as well. Susan, great to talk to you. I have one final question from our listeners, our viewers, which is basically asking whether or not the Biden administration's perspective on China is different from Obama's, or really more of a rhetorical change of tone. And the questioner asks, haven't our interests in the region and globally remained fairly stable? So how would you assess kind of Biden versus Obama and then broader US interests in the region over the last decade and a half?
Oh, that's a really interesting question and a tough one to answer because, as I said, I think the Biden folks are trying to keep their cards pretty close to the vest on China policy for very good reasons. But I think their view has changed probably from the Obama administration. And even during the Obama administration from 2009 to 2016, I think that the view of China was changing, mostly based on the way that China policy appeared to be changing, and also just China's de facto, increase in influence and power around the world. Both of those things kind of changed the way people in Washington viewed China, I think, and they do see it as much more of a real peer now, which explains in a way some of the difficulty that we have in dealing with China. But I think the Biden team is probably very close to the Obama administration in thinking about sort of practical ways to deal with China, as opposed to the Trump administration sort of rolling out these kind of transactional and punitive measures constantly, and trying to use the international system and allies and partners to get China, to moderate its behavior and to, figure out how to enforce the rules and incentivize China, as one of your listeners mentioned, to come to see itself and to be seen as an international good actor. I think we have a long way to go on that. I mean, I personally think China is making a lot of mistakes, and it is closing. And some of these things are things that we're not going to be able to affect, but a lot of the things we do have an impact on what China does. And the thing that strikes me, and maybe I'll just leave you with this comment about all the conversations I hear now in the US about China, is that people seem to be interpreting what China is doing as if it's an exogenous act and not at all in response to anything else that's happening in the world, including in response to things that the US is doing. I think what China does in many, many cases is in direct response to things that we're doing, but nobody talks about that in the US. And I think we need to think more about that.
Susan Thornton, Yale University Law School, so great to have you. Thank you. Appreciate you taking the time and for all of your work over the last 3 decades on US diplomacy. And thanks to our listeners and viewers. Have a good evening or a good rest of your day.